On the 23rd of February 2024, my dad Ian was diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer. And 1 month later, on the 21st of March at the age of 68, he died. I've wanted to make a video about my dad and the disease that killed him, so this is an account of his last few weeks from my perspective, not only as his son, but as the person responsible for all of the decisions regarding his care. This is not intended to garner sympathy for me, as cancer is something that affects, I think, a lot of people in some way or another. I feel that it is important to talk about the stages and emotions that we went through during this time. As a filmmaker and a photographer, my job is to think creatively, which has been so difficult to do since he died. So making this 3-part series with a crew of my incredibly talented friends and colleagues, I'm hoping that this will open my mind to going back to work, as well as helping others who may have had similar experiences. I will do my best to explain what we went through and be as concise as possible, but there is a large amount of information to get through, so I ask you to please bear with me. But with that being said, this is an account of the final month of my dad's life. On Friday the 23rd of February, around 2 p.m, I was at home with my fiancée Tash, sitting on my sofa, when I got a text from Dad asking if he could give me a call. I knew that he had been in the hospital the night before, as he had been feeling unwell for a while, mostly with a feeling of nausea, and the last I heard was he had suspected gallstones. When I called him, the conversation began with him telling me that he had a CT scan the night before. They then repeated this CT scan at 2 a.m. on Friday morning because they had seen something they didn't like the look of. I asked him if he was all right, to which he said he was okay in an obvious attempt to brush the question off, and then he paused. I said, "Dad, do you know something?" And then I could hear him start to cry, which was rare for him. He started to tell me he had been visited by some doctors a few hours ago, and they had told him that they had found a tumour in the body of his pancreas, as well as multiple shadows on his liver, and that these findings were consistent with late-stage pancreatic cancer. As soon as he said the tumour was in his pancreas, I knew what that meant, and I knew that pancreatic cancer is one of the ones that once you find it, the odds are it's far too late. So I just told him, "Dad, don't worry, whatever it is, we can deal with it, we can handle it, and I'm on my way and I'll be there soon." During the call, Tash had been listening next to me and was just holding my hand. I hung up and I just sat there for a moment and she hugged me. I showered, I put some clothes into a bag and we left. It was strange. There were no tears. I was just in a state of shock, to be honest. So we drove down to Southampton General, Tash dropped me off, and I went in to see him. He was in a bed by the window, and I gave him a hug, and he told me again about what they'd found. It turned out that he did actually have gallstones, which had caused an infection for which he was being treated with antibiotics, and that there was going to be a biopsy of the tumours, so the tumour in his pancreas and the tumour in his liver, in order to find out how far the cancer had progressed. The doctors had told him that with the information that they had from the scans, there was no doubt that this was a terminal diagnosis and that he wouldn't have much time. But at that point, we didn't know exactly how long it would be. So I sat with him for about an hour and we just talked about what this might mean. And Dad being Dad, all he wanted to talk about were his finances and who to call and where to look in his house for the paperwork we might need, which was the furthest thing from my mind at that moment in time, but he was always a pragmatist. I then called my mum. I told her the news. She was obviously shocked and upset and offered her support. We spoke for a few minutes and then I hung up and I had the same conversation with my older sister. Once I had told her what was going on, I went back to Dad's bedside and remained there for a few more hours until Tash picked me up and we went back to her parents' home for the night. When we got into bed that night, I stayed up for a few hours with Tash and I just broke down. I couldn't believe that this was happening to us. We were also due to get married in the summer and now there was a chance that Dad might not be alive to see it. I mean, eventually I was exhausted and finally slept for a few hours before heading back to the hospital. I was able to see his doctors and ask them the obvious questions about treatment options and if they had some kind of timeline for how long he might have left. The surgeon said, albeit reluctantly, because they don't like to estimate without a biopsy, that given the fact that the cancer that he has, if he decides to have treatment, you're looking at 6 to 9 months, and without treatment, it would be less. And I was like, okay, so 6 to 9 months. I mean, that's pretty good. That's more than I thought it would be, so that's great. However, later in the day, the doctors came round again, and this time they had a member of the palliative care team with them. And it was their opinion that the cancer had spread to a point where a biopsy just wasn't necessary. And instead, we should focus on quality of life instead of prolonging it with treatment. Because we all know that chemotherapy is incredibly hard on the human body. And in some cases, for those who have especially aggressive cancer, such as what Dad had, all it would do is destroy the time that he had left with so many horrible side effects that it's just not worth it. So Dad looked at me and said, I've had a great life. I don't think treatment is necessary. As hard as that was to hear, I knew he was right. There was no point in putting him through that when we could still have time without it. So after that, Dad decided not to tell any of his friends for now. So we told no one, apart from just family. And that's how the next few days progressed. We then started meeting with the palliative care team who would arrange what was going to happen when he was discharged from hospital. And they were brilliant, just amazing, because they said that they were going to visit his house, get him ready for what the remainder of his time might look like. And that support was just invaluable, honestly. I started calling his accountant regularly to understand where his assets were and what would happen to them after his death, his solicitor to make sure that his will was located. And basically, in my mind, I was trying to get all of this stuff sorted as quickly as possible and as early as possible so that I can spend as much time with him as his son before he dies. So I'm also thinking, right, you've not got much time left. What are the things that we could do together? And I asked him, what would you like to do? And he said, it was really simple. He was like, I want to go and see the rugby. And I said, great, that's easy. One of my clients is Saracen's Rugby Club. So I contacted them and I organised a day to go in order to see a game with him. And that was going to be a few days before my birthday in May. He had also said that his kind of stretch goal, I suppose, was that he wanted to be driven in a McLaren. So I started asking some of my friends who might have contacts with McLaren and see if I could arrange to have a car delivered to us so that I could drive it with him. And I started thinking, by doing all these things, we're really going to maximize the amount of time that we have left. So I'm thinking, cool, this is a good plan. These are things that we can action. So then, after almost a week in hospital, he got discharged to home under the care of this palliative care team from Mountbatten Hospice in Hampshire. And obviously, they'd given me a list of all of the medications that he needed to take, but the main one being oral morphine for his pain, along with the anti-sickness medications as well. But he also had something called Creon, and this is really weird because I don't actually know what the pancreas does. I don't think most people do. But Creon is an enzyme that the pancreas produces, and he had to make sure that he would take that with every meal and every snack, otherwise he would most likely vomit. So I made a spreadsheet, which Dad was very pleased with, because we always used to tease him about how he ran his life through a spreadsheet. So this was with the times of day and what he needed to have, whether he'd taken them, whether he hadn't taken them. So I had everything in one place. If you've ever stayed in hospital yourself, you know that you don't really get much rest because people are always talking. There's loads of noise. There's lights always coming on, other patients. There's just so much happening. It's really not a comfortable place to be. So I thought, as with the other surgeries that he'd had in the past, one of which was actually only 8 weeks before all of this started, that once he's been at home for 3 or 4 days, he'll start to generally feel better and start getting a little bit more energy back. because he'll have rested properly, and then we can start to go out and do some of the things that he'd asked me to organize for him. So the next day, I brought him loads of really nice food and was trying to encourage him to eat, and he was just really tired. And I was like, okay, fine. Like, he's only been out of hospital for a day, so we'll give it some time. And then the Thursday rolls round and he's the same. He can't really get out of bed or even stay awake for longer than an hour or two at most. And then on the Friday afternoon, we had a palliative care nurse come round to the house. Myself, Dad, and the nurse are in the lounge, and she's telling us she's part of the hospice care team. And anytime, day or night, if we need anything or if you're concerned, you can call us. And she was wonderful. She explained everything so clearly that we had so much support there. And as the meeting goes on, you can see that Dad is getting really tired. So I help him up to his bedroom, put him into bed, and I came back down. And when I got back down, I was just talking to the nurse, and I just said, he's really tired, like exhausted. When do you think that might ease up a little bit? And she said, well, you know what he has. And I was like, yeah, of course. Like, I get that. And she was like, no, you need to understand he's not going to get more energy. He won't get better. He's dying. And I said, yeah, but not for a few months. And she just said, I don't think so. I don't think it's going to be as long as that. Obviously, I was a bit confused. And at that point, we hadn't actually seen the oncologist. We actually had an appointment coming up on the Monday, so in a few days' time. But that was the moment that it really hit me, that he wasn't going to get better before he got worse. And I had clearly been really naive as to how unwell he truly was and how quickly the cancer was killing him. Over the weekend, he continued to deteriorate and was feeling really withdrawn and just drained, just so drained of everything. And then Monday rolls around and we're getting ready for the appointment with the oncologist. It turns out that our appointment was with this professor who is one of the best in the country. So we'll get some real answers and we'll be able to ask him how long Dad might have. Now, I remember it was raining, and as we drove down and everything was really quiet, and we arrived at the oncology unit at Southampton General. I helped him inside after I'd gone out and got him a wheelchair, and now we're sitting in the waiting room. And you know, when you go into a doctor's surgery or an A&E and you look around, you might see a person who looks really ill, and you look at them and you go, wow, like that person is really, really unwell. Dad was that person. And after a few minutes of sitting there, the nurse calls us in, and it's the professor, and he was like, he has this bow tie on, right? And he looked very academic, I guess. He just looked like a really smart, stereotypical teacher. And when we got into his office, Dad said he didn't feel very well and proceeded to vomit in the sink in this room. The oncologist was accompanied by the palliative care nurse who we've been speaking to while Dad had been an inpatient at the General, and she was just such a lovely woman. And so Dad composes himself and is then asked again to explain what the doctors had already told him. So Dad's sitting on my right, and then it's the oncologist who sits to the right of him, and the nurse is on a bed that's opposite Dad and I. So I'm nearest the door, and so Dad tells him, yes, I know I've got pancreatic cancer that has metastasized to the liver, and basically it's not looking good. And then it's time for the professor to speak, and this was probably the hardest part of this whole experience of Dad's illness, because he says, yes, we have found a tumor in your pancreas, we found the other tumors on your liver, and the second CT scan showed us that this cancer is very advanced. And then he asked me if I would like to see the CT scan images. And I said yes, because I was interested. And at first he showed me the pancreas, and the lesion that was there was 20 millimeters across. 20 millimeters. And then he showed me his liver, and he explained that a CT scan takes horizontal slices, and each of those layers, it will break apart. And he said, do you see all of those grey and dark spots that are everywhere? Those are all individual tumours. And he shows me these scans, and slice after slice is just covered in these masses. I sat back down and he said, given the advanced stage of the disease, I am going to suggest that we don't even attempt any form of treatment because you will not survive. There is nothing we can do. This is as far as medicine can take you. And at this point, I turn to look away and there's this clock on the wall, right? So I'm just staring at it. And I have no idea what the time was, but I'm just staring at it and it all sounds very dramatic and very theatrical, but I'm literally watching the second hand just tick. And I can feel these tears building up behind my eyes and I'm just staring at this clock. And Dad asks the only question which he can ask, which is, how long do you think I have left? And there was a pause. And the oncologist said, it's going to be more like a matter of weeks. And I could just feel every piece of hope and any thought of there being another good memory with him to come, and it just fell out of me. And I tried to be as quiet as I could, but I had tears just like streaming down my face. And Dad said again, I've had a really good life. So the appointment ends and we move into another room, this tiny little room with the nurse. And then she steps outside for a second and I just said, Dad, can I give you a hug? And he said no. And it really pissed me off. And then at this point, the nurse comes back in and I just say, look, I need a minute. I'm just going to step outside. So I left the room and went across the hall into this disabled toilet and I closed the door behind me and I just fell apart and I just collapsed on the floor and I just could not stop crying. It was those hysterical tears and it didn't last long. Like it literally lasted like a minute, maybe less. And I thought, I have to get back. I have to get back to him. So I pushed my back against the wall and I kind of slide myself up. I grab some tissue and I dry my face and go back into the room where Dad is. Then I wheeled him out of the unit, into the car, and we started to drive back. And it was really raining at this point. Like it was hammering it down. And as we're driving back, it's all very quiet, but I'm very aware that the radio was on. And I don't know what station it was, and I'm laughing because it's stupid. But it was like 80s music and like Motown classics. And obviously all of that music from that era is about dancing and disco and like basically good times, being happy. And I'm just listening to these songs and I'm laughing to myself because this is ridiculous, right? Like, it's pissing down with rain. This kind of music is playing where it's literally saying like about good times and happy memories. And I've just been told that my dad is going to be dead in a few weeks. And it's just all really surreal. And I'm trying to talk to him. I'm trying to just say something, trying to hold his hand, trying to reach out in any kind of way. And he's just doesn't want to know. And then so we got back home and Dad sits down on the sofa and puts on the TV like nothing happened. And I was just like, okay, like you're digesting. That's fine. Like do your thing. He puts on the TV and the TV show Pointless comes on. And I was like, this is just like, this is ridiculous. Like, it's like some kind of, it's just literally pointless. What are we doing here? And I sat opposite him on the opposite sofa and I'm just watching this show. And then I just look at him and I just say, look, mate, I have some things that I want to say to you and I don't know when to say them. So should I say them now? Do you want to wait? What do you want to do? And he was just like, yeah, sure. Like, let's have a chat. And I just said, can I please give you a hug? And he was like, of course you can. And I went over to the sofa and I got down on my knees because he was sitting and I didn't want to get him to stand up again. And I just wrapped my arms around him and just cried. And I just said, I am so sorry that this has happened to you. And I love you. And I'm so thankful that we have become so close in the last few years, because our relationship struggled for a long time. And it's really only been in the last 5 years or so that we've really made an effort to build those bridges again. And I just said, you've been such a good dad, and I am so grateful for everything that you've done for me. I know that I've not been easy, but thank you for supporting me in all of my ambitions and all my achievements. And he just said, like, I'm so proud of you. Like, my boy, I love you too. And you're on your way, which was his favorite thing to say, which is like, you're on your way. And it always sounds a bit ridiculous, but that is literally what he used to say all the time. And I was like, okay, cool. And then after that, after about an hour or so, he went to bed and went to sleep. I called Tash, I called my sister, I called my mum, I called my auntie. And each time I called someone, I pushed the pain down, like just a little bit further. And it got easier to just keep pushing down, because I couldn't deal with this right now. I still had a job to do, to look after him and make sure his last few weeks count. And I could face all of those feelings later, but right now, this is about Dad. And I couldn't let him see me cry anymore.